This video is for beyond categorical thinking trainers working on the section on how oppression works. I'm going to show you how I do the session so that trainers may then adapt how they can do the session to fill their own needs. You will have just completed the session on how would your life have been different, where people talk about their lives and if one change had been made in their lives. It often leads to a conversation about, well, why does any of this matter? Well, I'm going to talk to you about that right now. One of the things we do when we immediately see people is we assign them a gender. In fact, if you think about it, the first question we ask someone when we learn that someone is pregnant is, are you having a boy or a girl? Gender is tremendously ingrained into who we are and how we think about the world. I became very aware of this when I was working at the UUA and had an assistant for 9 years who was transgender. Now, my assistant was 5 feet 3 inches tall, was born in a woman's body, but identified with male pronouns. And I can specifically remember us walking down the streets of Boston to lunch or to various places and watching people do an immediate double take with their heads. And you could tell they were trying to figure out what my assistant's gender was. What was more interesting about that is that there were a significant number of these people who would get a very angry expression on their face. They would be mad that they themselves could not assign a gender to the person whom they were looking at. I even watched several people take their fists and pound it into their hands. They were so upset because it was so important to them to assign a gender. So it's the first thing we do when we see someone, and we do it in the fraction of a second. Now, we also do this around issues of race, but what's interesting is we don't get quite as mad or upset. We just miscategorize people. And for example, if we see someone who we assume to be of a particular race or ethnicity, we just assume that they are, even if we're wrong. I had a massage therapist who was from India, but right after 9/11, he began telling me the story of people talking to him about he should go home to Iraq and he should go back and join the other terrorists. He was even spit at on the subways and in the streets in Boston because people assumed that he was Iranian or Iraqi. And so people will assume an identity even if it's wrong. And they will make assumptions about the person because of their race or ethnicity, which we'll talk about in a minute. The same is true for disability. If we see someone who we know who we see has an obvious disability, what we often do is assume that's the entire identity of the person. We often forget that the person in the wheelchair has a sexual orientation, for example, or that the person who is blind or deaf has other things that they are interested in their lives. If someone tells us they have a disability, but we cannot perceive it, they are often assumed to be lazy or not working hard enough. They just need to try harder. How many people with various learning disabilities have been told over their lifetimes, if you just tried harder, you wouldn't have this particular problem? We also do this around sexual orientation, in that we assume that everyone has a heterosexual orientation when we see them, until we learn differently. As soon as we learn someone has a different sexual orientation other than heterosexual, then often assumptions are made about that particular person. In fact, what was interesting, I have a friend who is African American who is what I would refer to as very gay. In fact, he's so gay that people have told me they have forgotten that he is an African American and have simply addressed him as, who is that gay guy with you? And so it's interesting how issues of identity reduce people to a single story. There's a Nigerian author named Chimamanda Adichie who says this about stereotypes and what we do with them. She says, the problem with stereotypes is not that they are wrong, but the problem with stereotypes is that they are limiting, and they limit people to a single story. So often we see that happen to ministers in our congregation, where because of one particular identity, they are reduced to a single story. I had this happen to me once when I was preaching at a congregation one Sunday morning. I had just returned from church camp, and I had gone the next day to preach. And I delivered the sermon. They'd asked me to come and speak about gay and lesbian issues. And after the service, this woman comes up to me, and she has this look on her face. And she has this look on her face that tells me, I'm in deep trouble. And she starts pointing at me with her finger, and she says, I figured something out. She said, I figured out why you're wearing that purple shirt. You're wearing that purple shirt because it's the national color of gay and lesbian people. And I looked at her and said, no, I'm wearing this purple shirt because I just got back from church camp, and this was the clean one I found this morning. But she had reduced me to a single story because she had made this assumption based on one aspect of my identity. We see this happen for literally every minister of color in our movement. We see that they are reduced to, is this minister only going to talk about issues of race and ethnicity? Here's the way it happens in our congregations. A congregation will call a minister of color. A third of the congregation is delirious that they've called a minister of color because now the congregation is going to finally start to address issues of race and ethnicity. A third of the congregation is delirious that they've called a minister of color because this proves that they are in fact not racist. All you have to do is look at Exhibit A in the pulpit every Sunday morning, and there's the proof that we're not. And yet there's the third of the congregation that is afraid. And they're afraid that all the minister is going to talk about are issues of race and ethnicity. And often people forget that the minister may have no interest in talking about these issues whatsoever, but because the person is a person of color, they assume that this is what the conversation is going to be about. I have yet to talk with a minister of color in our movement where this has not been the story that they have encountered and had to deal with once they have arrived at a congregation. And the minister finds herself or himself between two rocks and a hard place. Because what happens is she or he decides, if I bring this up, this is going to be proof to that third of the congregation that I am in fact a single issue minister, that this is all that I talk about. So often what we see with ministers of particular identities is that they don't talk about that particular identity because they're afraid of being tagged as that single issue minister. We see this play out in search committees. We had a congregation assume any number of things about ministers who happened to be gay. One congregation assumed that because a minister was gay, all he preached about was about gay sermons. I actually looked at this minister's packets and discovered of the 7 minister's sermons, only one might potentially be constituted as a gay sermon because it was about his journey to ministry and about his coming out process. 2 other sermons mentioned the word gay or lesbian, but none of them talked about it specifically in the sermon. 4 of the sermons in his packet talked about nothing that was gay or lesbian related, and yet this search committee assumed that all this minister talked about was about gay or lesbian issues in their sermon. We don't hear that around ministers who identify as heterosexual, or all you preach about are straight sermons. We don't hear this about ministers who are white. Do you only preach sermons about whiteness? Or people who are able-bodied? So there are double standards, and the double standards are what create the oppression that happens in our congregations. We've also seen people make assumptions because they have met one minister who was of a particular identity. We had a search committee one time where its first choice was a minister who identified as gay. That minister pulled out for personal reasons, and so their second choice was another gay minister. And part of the reason they assumed that is they assumed the 2 ministers were alike. They had never considered the fact that the first minister they called matched their humanist theology, identified as socially liberal, and was very extroverted. The second gay minister who was a part of their process, who they brought forth to be their candidate, they didn't think about this fact that the minister identified as Christian, as politically conservative, and as someone who was very introverted, who was not particularly self-revealing. So that ended up being a very bad thing that happened in the congregation, and it ended up not being a good match for the congregation. And so often in our congregations, we hear people say, well, why do these identities matter? Why do we have to talk about them at all? But as you can see, these identities are a part of who we are, and we talk about them all the time. To give you another example, think for a moment, try and tell the story of The Wizard of Oz without using any reference at all to any of the characters' identity. You literally cannot tell that story and have it make sense without referencing the identity of each of these characters. They are part of who they are, but they are only one part of that person's story. A person is multiple stories. And what we often do with issues of oppression is we place more importance on particular identities around race, gender, sexual orientation, around disability. And yet there are other identities that become very important that we don't think about. For example, I often ask people in congregation, who here is the oldest child? Who here is the youngest? Who here is the middle child? Who here is an only child? And I get a various number of people who hold up their hand and say, yes, I was one of those. Of course, everyone holds up their hand at a certain point. But we don't often go up to a person and go, the reason you did that is because you were a middle child. Or the reason you did that is because you were an only child. We do have instances where people go up to ministers and say, well, you did that because you were African American. You did that because you are in a scooter. You did that because you are bisexual. And that is again, yet another double standard that people have to face. I often ask people how many people in the room are left-handed, and a small percentage of people generally raise their hands. And yet we talk about how we live in a very right-handed world. One of the things that we don't know is that left-handed people actually have shorter life expectancies than right-handed people, mainly because of things like accidents in cars and in the workplace, where everything is designed for right-handed people. And when left-handed people go to react in a car or a machine that is designed for a right-handed person, the reactions are slowed down and accidents are more likely to happen. But we don't assume that a person did something because they were right-handed or left-handed. We also see this in terms of religious identity. How many people in the room were born Unitarian Universalist? How many people in the room came to Unitarian Universalism from another religious tradition? How many people came to Unitarian Universalism from no religious tradition? And yet all of these things are significant factors in the shaping of a particular person and a part of who they are. But we don't tell someone you did this because you've never been a Unitarian Universalist until you started going to church. So these are the double standards that we talk about. And that our task and the importance of looking at identity, and if we want to end oppression, is to go back to what Chimamanda Adichie was talking about, is to not let the stereotype become the single story. It is to let people be seen as multiple stories and understand that people have various things that make up who they are. And the reason that a person does something may have nothing to do with their race or sexual orientation or gender or disability, but any number of other factors from their lives. In fact, most of what we do comes from the multiple identities that we live with. And that is how oppression works in our congregation, and why it is important for us to do this workshop and to think about this as we move forward.